A few years ago, I made the decision to pack up my entire life and move to a small, isolated rural community. I grew up in a fairly large city, and if you have ever lived in a major metropolitan area, you know exactly how it is. It was loud, chaotic, and completely overwhelming all the time. There was never a moment of peace. Sirens were blaring at all hours of the night, traffic was constant, and angry people were always rushing around on the crowded sidewalks. I spent my weekends looking at maps of upstate wilderness, dreaming of the day I could finally escape the concrete jungle. As soon as I was old enough and could finally afford it on my own, I knew I had to get away. I wanted to find a place where I could actually hear my own thoughts. The town I ended up moving to is incredibly small. It is nestled right in the middle of dense forests and rolling mountains. No matter what season of the year it is, the landscape is absolutely beautiful. In the winter, the trees are covered in thick white snow, and in the autumn, the leaves turn into these brilliant shades of orange and red. It almost blows my mind that this little town is not a major tourist trap during the summer and fall. But for some reason, people just do not know about it, and the locals like to keep it that way. This quiet little town does not have much to offer in terms of modern conveniences. There are just a few local restaurants, a couple of quiet bars where the same people sit every single night, a single gas station that also does car repairs, one small supermarket, and a tiny police station with only a few officers. That is basically it. If you want to go to a major store like Walmart, you have to drive about an hour away on winding country roads. My little paradise of a town is really off the grid, and honestly, I would not want it any other way. I have been living here for over 3 years now, and other than one horrible day that still haunts me, it has been absolutely great. But even the most peaceful and beautiful towns can sometimes hide the darkest secrets. When I first moved to town, I needed to find a way to make some extra money, so I got a part-time job at the local supermarket. I used to manage one of the major grocery store chains back in my hometown, so I had a lot of experience with how these places operate. My job was pretty simple. I would go into the store first thing in the morning, around 5 o'clock, and help unload the delivery trucks and stock the shelves. I liked the quiet routine of it. I would lift the heavy cardboard boxes, open them up with my box cutter, and place the jars of sauce and cans of soup neatly on the shelves. The owner of the supermarket noticed my work ethic and actually offered me a full-time management position, but I politely turned him down. I only wanted to work part-time, basically just to have a little extra spending money and an excuse to get out of the house. You see, I also have a part-time job that I do completely online, which involves database management, and that is actually where the bulk of my income comes from. I wanted as much free time as I could possibly afford, so I could pursue my real passions, which are hiking and fishing. There are so many vast woodlands in this area that it would easily take me a lifetime to hike them all. Of course, I was fully up for the challenge. Every single day off I had, whether it was raining or the sun was shining, I would find a new area on the map to explore, pack up my gear, and head into the woods for the entire day. It did not take me very long to get used to this new lifestyle. Almost immediately after moving into my new place, I started hitting the wilderness trails and trying to meet the local residents. In the evenings, I would grab a bite to eat at one of the small restaurants in town, and I quickly learned that almost everyone in the area was unexpectedly pleasant and welcoming. They were the kind of people who would wave to you on the street even if they did not know your name. But there was one exception. I am referring to a man named Hector. Now, I should clarify that Hector was not necessarily mean or rude to people. He was just incredibly strange. He was the kind of person who seemed like he was living on an entirely different planet. The very first time I met Hector, I was just arriving at work at the supermarket. It was a little after 5 o'clock in the morning, and the sky was still pitch black. As I was getting out of my car, this man suddenly ran right up to my driver's side window. Where I am from, if someone runs up to your car like that in the dark, your natural instinct is to protect yourself, and you might even punch them in the face before they can do anything to you. But things are different out here. I put my hands up in a defensive position and started yelling at him to back away. Instead of running off, he looked right at me, screamed directly in my face, and then skipped away. He did not run or walk. He legitimately skipped like a happy child. As I was standing there in the cold morning air, completely confused and trying to process what had just happened, one of my coworkers walked up to me. He patted me on the shoulder and told me that the man was named Hector and that he was completely harmless. According to my coworker, Hector had lived in or around the town for a very long time, but nobody actually knew where his home was. Everyone in town just assumed that he was homeless and probably lived under one of the old wooden bridges in the area. The locals just chose to leave him alone and let him wander around the streets because he had never hurt anybody, even though it was incredibly alarming for a strange man to scream in my face. First thing in the morning, I decided to trust the locals. If everyone in town claimed he was harmless, then I was not going to make a big deal out of it. For the next few weeks, I started seeing Hector almost everywhere I went. It did not matter if I was driving to work at the crack of dawn or leaving the local bar after 11 o'clock at night. I would see him just wandering down the sides of the streets. He was a very short guy, but he looked incredibly strong. He was built like an absolute ox. He could not have been taller than 5 feet and 3 inches at the very most. He was always wearing the exact same outfit. He had on a stained white tank top and a pair of royal blue pants. I could never quite tell if they were worn-out jeans or just heavy sweatpants. He had a very long, dirty gray beard that hung down past his chest, and his remaining hair was tied back into a ponytail, even though he was completely bald on the top of his head. But even with this incredibly strange physical appearance, the most notable and bizarre thing about Hector was his method of transportation. Every single time you saw him moving, he was skipping. He would skip down the sidewalk, skip across the street, and skip past the shops. Seeing him skip around with such blissful ignorance was almost enough to make you envious of him sometimes. One morning, as I was driving to my shift at the supermarket, I saw Hector standing on a street corner. He was facing the opposite direction of my car, looking out toward an empty field. As I approached the intersection, I noticed that he was waving his hand frantically, as if he was trying to get the attention of someone in the distance. But when I actually passed through the intersection and looked closer, I realized there was absolutely nobody there. He was waving at thin air. Then he started talking, gesturing wildly with his hands and looking incredibly animated. He was having a full, intense conversation with someone who did not exist. I just continued driving past him and minded my own business. Honestly, it is not that unusual for someone in Hector's position to talk to themselves, especially if they are not posing a danger to themselves or anyone else around them. I really did not care what he was doing with his free time, but that next weekend, things took a very dark turn. It was my day off, and I decided to hit the woods for another long hike. I spent a few hours exploring a deep, dense part of the forest that I had never been to before. There were no marked trails out there, just thick brush and towering trees. While I was deep in the heart of the forest, miles away from the nearest road, I suddenly froze. I thought I could hear the faint sound of a human voice echoing through the trees. Hearing any kind of voice this deep in the wilderness is immediately alarming. This was not a public park where families go for afternoon walks. This was pure, untamed wilderness, and finding another person out here was highly unusual. The sound of that voice instantly made me feel incredibly unnerved. I know it was a sketchy decision, but curiosity got the better of me. I wanted to know who else was out in these woods and what they were doing so far off the path. Instead of turning around and retreating back to my car, I began to move slowly and quietly toward the source of the sound. As I got closer, the trees became thicker, and the sound of the voices became much clearer. I could tell that one of the voices sounded like it was in deep distress, almost as if someone was crying or pleading. I reached into my pocket, grabbed my folding knife, and opened it, just in case I ran into trouble. I continued to sneak forward, placing my feet carefully on the damp moss so I would not snap any twigs. The voices seemed to be coming from just behind a thick grouping of pine trees directly in front of me. When I finally reached the trees and peered through the branches, I could not believe what I was looking at. It was not a group of people at all. It was just Hector. He was standing in a small clearing completely alone, but he was holding a conversation with himself, and he was rapidly changing his voice. One of the voices he used was incredibly angry, harsh and belittling. This angry voice was calling him a coward and saying some absolutely terrible things. Then, in the blink of an eye, the angry voice disappeared and Hector started to weep. He fell to his knees crying hysterically and began begging for forgiveness in a completely different, high-pitched voice. It was one of the most terrifying things I had ever witnessed because each voice sounded like an entirely different person was speaking. I decided that the best thing I could do was to stay hidden behind the thick pine tree. I had absolutely no intention of engaging with him or letting him know that I was watching. But as I was standing there, trying to hold my breath, the angry voice suddenly came back. Without Hector even turning his head or looking in my direction, he screamed out in a booming voice, saying that someone was hiding behind the tree. He screamed that this time they could not let him get away. My heart dropped into my stomach. I watched as Hector slowly stood up from the ground and turned his head. He looked directly at the exact tree I was hiding behind, staring straight through the branches at me. For the very first time since I had moved to this town, I did not see a harmless, eccentric man. I saw genuine, pure rage in his eyes. I took a hurried step backward, my mind racing as I tried to process how he had known I was there, but I did not have time to think. Right at that exact second, Hector let out a blood-curdling scream and charged directly at me. He was not skipping anymore. He was sprinting on all fours at first, then rising up, running faster than I ever thought a human could run through thick brush. He was incredibly fast, and he was coming right for me. I turned around and ran as fast as my legs could carry me, heading back in the general direction of where I had parked my car. For what felt like an eternity, I could hear Hector right on my tail. The sound of crashing branches and heavy footsteps was incredibly close behind me. He kept screaming at the top of his lungs, yelling that I was not going to make it out of these woods alive. He would let out a loud, maniacal laugh and then transition back into a furious scream. Every few minutes, it sounded like he was only inches away from me, and I kept expecting to feel his hands grab the back of my jacket, but somehow I managed to keep just ahead of him. Eventually, after what felt like miles of running through the dense brush, the sounds behind me began to fade. The screaming grew more distant, and the woods went completely quiet again. I finally made it back to the edge of the forest where my car was parked. I immediately ducked down behind the door, catching my breath and looking in every direction to see if he had followed me all the way out. But Hector was nowhere to be found. The woods were completely still. I got into my car, locked the doors, and drove straight to the local police station to report what had happened. When I arrived, I spoke directly with the sheriff and told her everything. To my surprise, she looked at me with deep skepticism. She told me she had known Hector for years, and simply could not imagine him acting with that kind of anger and violence. But then, I described the exact area of the woods where the encounter had taken place. As I pointed to the rough location on the map, I watched the color completely drain from the sheriff's face. She turned as white as a ghost. She told me that the area I was describing was several hours of hard hiking deep into the wilderness, and she could not believe Hector was even capable of getting out there. But then she told me the most disturbing part. Right in that exact area of the forest several years ago, hikers had discovered the skeletal remains of a local man who had gone missing from the town. The discovery had been incredibly disturbing and had cast a dark shadow over the entire community. The police had never been able to find out who was responsible for the man's death, and it remained one of the only unsolved violent crimes in the town's history. The sheriff stared at the map, and she began to wonder out loud if Hector might have actually had something to do with that horrible crime. She tried to recall exactly when Hector had first appeared in the town. Her memory was a bit fuzzy, but she realized that Hector had started showing up on the streets around the exact same time the remains were found in the woods. She asked me if I could lead her and a deputy back to the exact location of the clearing, because she wanted to bring Hector in for questioning. We headed back into the woods, but by the time we reached the clearing, Hector was long gone. The sheriff, who has since retired, became incredibly emotional standing in that spot. She confirmed it was the exact location where the body had been found all those years ago. They never found Hector. Nobody in the town ever saw him again. He vanished into the woods that day and was never heard from again. I still go out and hike in those woods every chance I get, but things are different now. Every single time I step under the canopy of the trees, I find myself looking over my shoulder, fully expecting Hector to jump out from behind a trunk and continue the chase. I always make sure to carry a heavy knife and a canister of bear spray on my belt. Sometimes, the people who seem the most harmless and eccentric can actually be hiding the most terrifying secrets. I still do not know for sure if Hector was the one who committed that terrible crime years ago, but after seeing the sheer rage in his eyes and hearing the voices he kept hidden inside his head, it would not surprise me at all. It makes me realize that we truly never know what someone is capable of, and that brings me to the second story I want to share with you, which is a highly unsettling experience that happened to a young couple named Artie and Katie. This is a story that Artie actually wrote down, while the details were still fresh in his mind, because he was so deeply shaken by what they had experienced during a hiking trip in upstate New York. Artie and Katie were both experienced hikers who loved nothing more than escaping the noise of the city and spending days off the grid. They packed their heavy backpacks with freeze-dried meals, a sturdy lightweight tent, sleeping bags, and navigation tools. They had planned a 4-day, 3-night backpacking trip through the beautiful mountain trails of New York State. The nature there is incredibly vast and underrated, and they were looking forward to some quiet time together. But their peaceful vacation was about to turn into an absolute nightmare. The first day of their trip actually went very smoothly. There were a few light patches of rain here and there, but nothing that their gear could not handle. They found a beautiful secluded spot to set up their tent, cooked some dinner over a small stove, and turned in early so they could get a head start on the trail the following morning. But during the middle of the night, Artie suddenly woke up. The forest was pitch black, and he noticed that Katie was sitting straight up next to him in the sleeping bag. She was completely frozen, and even in the dim light, he could see that she was terrified. Artie whispered to her, asking if she was okay. Katie was trembling so hard that she could barely speak, but eventually she managed to whisper that she had heard something moving outside the tent. Artie assumed it was probably just a deer or a raccoon, as wild animals are incredibly common in that area. But the sheer level of panic in Katie's voice made him think otherwise. He reached out his hand to unzip the tent door to take a look, but as soon as his fingers touched the metal zipper, Katie let out a sharp gasp and grabbed his wrist. She begged him not to open it. Artie stared at her, trying to figure out if she had just had a bad dream and was still waking up. But as they sat there in the silence, he suddenly heard it too. There were heavy, distinct footsteps circling the tent. It was immediately clear that these were not the footsteps of an animal. An animal moves with a specific rhythm, but these steps were slow, deliberate, and bipedal. Someone was walking around their campsite. To make things even more terrifying, every few minutes the person outside would let out a soft, high-pitched giggle. Artie and Katie sat completely paralyzed in the dark, clutching each other and listening to the footsteps. They had no idea what to do. They decided that the safest option was to stay inside the tent, keep completely quiet, and hope that whoever was out there would eventually leave. The footsteps continued for what felt like hours, but eventually the giggling stopped, and the sounds faded into the quiet of the forest. When dawn finally broke, Artie slowly unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The campsite was empty, and he felt a brief wave of relief. But that relief vanished when he looked down at the ground. Scattered all around their tent were dozens of strange rocks. Artie knew for a fact that those rocks had not been there the night before. Even worse, the rocks had been carefully stacked and arranged into weird, deliberate formations. Katie was completely done with the trip and wanted to pack up and go home right then and there. But Artie, regretting it deeply now, convinced her that it was probably just some local teenagers playing a prank on them. He persuaded her to keep going with their plan. The second day of the hike was miserable. Katie was incredibly paranoid, constantly looking over her shoulder and feeling convinced that someone was following them through the trees. Artie kept stopping to look back, but he never saw anything. By the middle of the afternoon, Katie was completely exhausted from the stress, and they decided to set up camp early. Katie made Artie promise that they would head back to the car first thing in the morning. That night, Artie expected Katie to stay awake, but she was so physically and emotionally drained that she fell asleep almost instantly. Artie, however, could not sleep. He lay there in the dark, listening to the wind rustling the leaves. Just as he was finally starting to drift off, he heard a faint whisper right outside the fabric of the tent. It jolted him wide awake. He looked at Katie, but she was still sound asleep. Then the whisper came again. It was a soft, chilling female voice, and it clearly said, "Come outside, Artie." Artie felt his blood run cold. He had never met anyone in these woods, and there was absolutely no way anyone should have known his name. Before he could even process this, a second, different female voice whispered, "Yeah, Artie, please come outside, we are waiting." Artie sat frozen, refusing to move. Suddenly the quiet whispers turned into frantic running. Multiple people were sprinting around the tent, laughing uncontrollably with high-pitched cackling voices. The cackling grew louder, and then one of the voices suddenly dropped into an incredibly deep, aggressive tone, shouting, "Come outside now." The loud scream instantly woke Katie up, and she began to panic. Before Artie could explain what was happening, the people outside began to physically grab and push against the sides of the tent. They were leaning their weight into the fabric, actually shifting the tent and moving Artie and Katie across the ground. The high-pitched laughing continued throughout the chaos. Artie had never felt so helpless in his entire life. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the physical attacks stopped, and they heard the sound of multiple footsteps running away into the deep woods. For 30 minutes, Artie and Katie sat in absolute silence, staring at each other in the dark. Finally, Artie decided he had to look. He slowly unzipped the tent flap a few inches, while Katie squeezed his arm with terrifying strength. Standing about 20 feet away, bathed in the moonlight, was a young woman in her 20s. She was wearing a clean white dress, which looked incredibly bizarre in the middle of the dirty, rugged wilderness. She was staring directly at the tent, wearing a wide, empty smile, and she slowly waved her hand at Artie. He quickly zipped the tent back up. They did not sleep for the rest of the night. At dawn, they packed their bags in seconds and ran all the way back to their car, leaving behind the strange rock piles and stick symbols that had been left around their camp. They never went back to those woods, and they still have no logical explanation for how those women knew Artie's name. It is a reminder that there are things in the deep forests that we simply cannot explain. And that leads me to the final story, which involves a group of 3 high school friends named Theo, Carlos, and the narrator. Every single year since they graduated, these 3 friends would go on an annual backpacking trip into the wilderness to keep their friendship alive. When they were teenagers, they were absolutely obsessed with exploring and searching for hidden caves in the woods. They would spend hours looking at old geological maps and packing their flashlights, hoping to find a secret passage. Over the years, they had actually found several interesting geological formations, but nothing could have prepared them for what they stumbled upon during one of their trips. They were hiking deep in an unfamiliar forest when they came across a small, dilapidated wooden cabin. It looked completely out of place, standing entirely alone in the middle of nowhere. The friends joked about how they were stepping right into a classic horror movie setup, but curiosity got the better of them. They approached the structure and looked through the cracked windows. The cabin was clearly abandoned. The interior was almost entirely empty, save for a few pieces of broken, rotting wooden furniture scattered on the floor. Carlos suggested they go inside to explore, and since they had seen plenty of strange things in the woods over the years, including an abandoned circus village filled with decaying wooden huts and old rusty props, they did not think twice about it. The building was extremely small, essentially just a single large wooden room with no electricity, no running water, and absolutely no roads or trails leading to it. As they stood inside the dusty, dry room, they suddenly heard a very strange noise. It was a slow, heavy scraping sound, like something heavy was being dragged across dirt. What made it unsettling was that the sound was coming from directly beneath their feet. The cabin did not appear to have a basement. so Artie knelt down and placed his ear against the wooden floorboards to listen. Sure enough, the dragging sound was coming from right below the floor. He began kicking away the dirt and broken furniture in the corner of the room, and underneath the debris, he discovered a rusted iron handle set into a trapdoor. He pulled the heavy door open, and a sickening, foul odor immediately rushed out. It smelled like rotten, decaying meat. Artie wrapped a bandana around his nose, grabbed his flashlight, and began to climb down the wooden ladder into the darkness. The air down there was unnaturally cold. As he shone his flashlight around, he saw a stone cellar with two massive structural beams supporting the ceiling. Suddenly, limping out from behind one of the wooden beams was a man. He was wearing a green t-shirt and jeans, with messy dark hair. He was dragging his right foot behind him, creating the scraping sound they had heard from above. The man ignored Artie's yells and just kept pacing back and forth, mumbling to himself in a language that was definitely not English. The man suddenly stopped pace and turned his head to stare directly at me with lifeless, empty eyes. He took a single, slow step toward the ladder, and a wave of pure terror washed over me. I climbed up that ladder as fast as my hands could move, yelling at Carlos and Theo that we had to leave immediately. We looked down the hatch one last time and saw him standing at the bottom, looking up at us. We ran out of the cabin and did not stop until we reached our vehicle. We reported the incident to the local police, but when they fully investigated, they found absolutely nothing in the dark cellar. The man had simply vanished, leaving behind only the cold stone walls. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.